In 1978, Ford Motor Company posted $2 billion in profit. It was one of the most successful years in the company's history. The man most responsible for that success was Lee Iacocca, the president of Ford and the executive who had created the Mustang, the car that sold over 400,000 units in its first year and put Ford back on the map. 1 month after those profits were announced, Henry Ford II called Iacocca into his office and fired him. When a reporter asked Ford why he had let go of the most successful executive in the auto industry, Ford gave an answer that would become infamous. Sometimes you just don't like somebody. What Ford could not have known was that the man he fired out of jealousy would go on to save his biggest competitor from bankruptcy. And in doing so, Iacocca would build the very products that Ford had rejected, generate billions in profit for Chrysler, and watch Ford Motor Company slowly lose the empire his family had spent 3 generations building. This is the story of how ego destroyed a dynasty. Lee Iacocca was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1924. His father, Nicola, was an Italian immigrant who had arrived at Ellis Island in 1902 with nothing. By the time Lee was born, Nicola owned a hot dog restaurant and one of the first car rental agencies in the city. He called it "You Drive It." From childhood, Lee Iacocca was obsessed with automobiles. Henry Ford was his idol. He dreamed of working for Ford Motor Company the way other kids dreamed of playing baseball. He earned an engineering degree from Lehigh University, then a master's from Princeton. In 1946, at 21 years old, he joined Ford Motor Company as an engineering trainee, but he quickly realized his talent was not in designing cars, it was in selling them. He asked to be transferred to sales, and his career began to take off. By 1956, Iacocca was an assistant sales manager in Ford's Philadelphia district. That year, he created a promotion that would change his life. He called it 56 for 56, a new 1956 Ford for $56 a month, with 20% down, paid over 3 years. The campaign was so successful that Ford's Vice President Robert McNamara, who would later become Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, took it national. Ford sold 72,000 additional cars, and Iacocca was summoned to company headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan. He was 32 years old. He was about to become the most powerful executive in the American auto industry who was not named Ford. But that power would eventually make him a target. Because Henry Ford II did not like to share the spotlight. The Ford Mustang changed everything. In 1960, Iacocca was named Vice President and General Manager of the Ford division. He was convinced that a new generation of young Americans wanted something different, a sporty, affordable car that felt exciting without costing a fortune. Henry Ford II was skeptical. The company was still recovering from the Edsel disaster, which had cost Ford hundreds of millions of dollars. The last thing he wanted was another risky new car, but Iacocca was relentless. He assembled a team that worked in secret, holding meetings at the Fairlane Inn Motel to avoid detection. They called themselves the Fairlane Committee. On April 17, 1964, Ford unveiled the Mustang at the New York World's Fair. The night before, the car appeared in commercials on all 3 major television networks simultaneously. The company bought advertising in 2,600 newspapers on a single day. The result was pandemonium. 22,000 Mustangs sold on the first day alone. By the end of the first year, Ford had sold 418,000 units, shattering every sales record in automotive history. And Lee Iacocca became a star. He appeared on the covers of both Time and Newsweek in the same week, the first auto executive ever to do so. Time called him the hottest thing in Detroit. In December 1970, Henry Ford II made Iacocca president of Ford Motor Company. Iacocca was 46 years old and seemingly destined to run the company when Ford retired. But that's when the relationship began to curdle. Because as Iacocca's profile grew, Henry Ford's jealousy grew with it. In 1975, Henry Ford II authorized $1.5 million in company funds for a secret investigation into Lee Iacocca's business and personal life. The investigation was led by Theodore Souris, a former Michigan Supreme Court justice. It began in August of 1975 and ran through December. Private detectives were hired, 500 interviews were conducted, 50 Ford executives were questioned. Investigators demanded to see records from Ford's suppliers, from steel companies, from advertising agencies like J. Walter Thompson, and from travel companies owned by Iacocca's friends. They were looking for anything: corruption, mob ties, affairs, financial impropriety. There were even attempts to link Iacocca to the Italian mafia based on nothing more than his heritage. They found nothing. But the investigation accomplished something else. The leading questions asked by investigators generated rumors throughout the industry. When people at major banks and suppliers were asked accusatory questions about Iacocca, they began to whisper. By the time the investigation ended, Iacocca's reputation had been damaged, even though no wrongdoing was ever discovered. Ford never told Iacocca about the investigation directly. Iacocca only learned of it from friends and business associates who had been questioned. And the conflict between the two men intensified. Ford began restructuring the company to reduce Iacocca's authority. He brought in McKinsey consultants to reorganize management. He placed other executives between himself and Iacocca. Meanwhile, Iacocca saw the future clearly. He knew that after the oil shocks of 1973 and 1974, American consumers would demand smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. He proposed buying engines from Honda to cut development costs and get to market faster. Ford rejected the idea. Ford said no car with my name on the hood is going to have a Jap engine inside. Iacocca and his colleague Hal Sperlich developed a concept they called the Mini Max, a smaller van that could fit in a standard garage and appeal to families. Ford rejected that too. In 1977, Ford fired Sperlich entirely. The message was clear. Henry Ford II was not interested in the future Iacocca could see. He was interested in protecting his own power, and Iacocca was running out of time. On July 13, 1978, Lee Iacocca was summoned to Henry Ford's office just before 3 in the afternoon. Ford had been suffering from a heart condition and was planning to retire. He wanted to pass the company to his son Edsel, who was only 28. Iacocca was in the way. Ford told Iacocca he was dismissed. When Iacocca asked why, Ford gave him the answer that would become legendary. Sometimes you just don't like somebody. The firing shocked the automotive industry. Ford Motor Company had just posted a $2 billion profit. Iacocca had created the Mustang, the Mark III, and the Fiesta. He had been with the company for 32 years. None of it mattered. Ford announced the firing before Iacocca could tell his own family. His daughter was at summer camp when other children began mocking her about her father losing his job. She called home in tears, asking if it was true. Iacocca had to tell her yes. As a final insult, Ford offered Iacocca an office to pursue new professional opportunities. When Iacocca arrived, he found it was in a warehouse building. He walked in, looked around, and left within 10 minutes. He understood the message. The two men never spoke again. Years later, when they encountered each other at a charity event, Henry Ford II turned and walked away without a word. But Lee Iacocca was not finished. He was about to prove exactly what Henry Ford had thrown away. Chrysler was dying. When Iacocca joined as president in late 1978, the company was losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Its cars were poorly built, its reputation was in shambles, and bankruptcy seemed inevitable. In 1979, Iacocca did something no major auto executive had ever done. He went to Congress and asked for help. The request was controversial. Senator William Proxmire warned that bailing out Chrysler would set a dangerous precedent. Critics said the company should be allowed to fail. But Iacocca made the case that Chrysler's collapse would devastate the American economy. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were at stake. Suppliers would fail. Communities would be destroyed. Congress passed the Chrysler Corporation Loan Guarantee Act in December 1979. President Jimmy Carter signed it into law on January 7, 1980. The federal government guaranteed up to $1.5 billion in loans, the largest bailout of a private company in American history. But the government did not just hand Chrysler a check. In exchange, Chrysler had to secure $2 billion in concessions from unions, banks, and suppliers. The United Auto Workers agreed to wage cuts that left Chrysler workers earning $2 an hour, less than their counterparts at Ford and General Motors. Banks agreed to defer loan payments, suppliers agreed to discounts, and Iacocca cut his own salary to $1 a year. It was the most dramatic corporate restructuring America had ever seen, and Iacocca made himself the face of it. He appeared in television commercials himself, looking directly into the camera and saying, If you can find a better car, buy it. It was audacious, it was personal, and it worked. In 1981, Chrysler released the K cars, the Dodge Aries and Plymouth Reliant. They were compact, fuel-efficient, and affordable. Nearly 1 million Aries sold over the model's lifetime. The K cars stabilized Chrysler's finances and bought Iacocca time for his real masterstroke. Then in 1983, Chrysler introduced the vehicle that Henry Ford had rejected years earlier, the minivan. The Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager were exactly what Iacocca and Sperlich had envisioned at Ford, built on a car-like platform with a flat floor, a sliding door, and room for the whole family. First-year sales exceeded 200,000 units. The minivan created an entirely new vehicle category. It would become the best-selling vehicle type of the 1980s, and the product that defined Chrysler for a generation. By 2014, Chrysler had sold over 13 million minivans. Chrysler repaid its federal loans in 1983, 7 years ahead of schedule. The government earned approximately $500 million in profit on the deal. In 1984, Chrysler posted record profits of $2.4 billion. Lee Iacocca became a national celebrity. His autobiography became a #1 bestseller. There was serious talk of him running for president, and Henry Ford II watched from the sidelines as the man he had fired built an empire on the ideas Ford had rejected. Henry Ford II stepped down as Chief Executive Officer of Ford Motor Company in 1979 and as chairman in 1980. He died of pneumonia on September 29, 1987. He was 70 years old. By then, the damage to Ford Motor Company was becoming clear. In 1980, Detroit automakers held 80% of the